something for 2 years, it has evolved, it has different players, it has different questions, and there are all kinds of things that you didn't know when it first started. So the league examined what the environmental effects of natural gas drilling were for the shale. And this particular study took us down an interesting path. I became personally involved because I was very interested in water quality. And so I thought, well, it's going to be a nice little 2-year program, and that will be it for now. Well, this is going on my 7th year. And it is the kind of thing that important issues do not get solved overnight. And so the one thing I want to encourage all of you who are the Mayflower residents and the Little Rock residents concerned, I think you really need to start pacing yourself. You really need to understand that you're in this for the long haul, and you will have tremendous opportunities to build on your knowledge and pass on your knowledge to other people who come in as time goes past. But it is going to be a staying opportunity. This is a long-term run and not a sprint. And so I want you to feel like you are learning at this stage. We are all coming into things at the bottom of the learning curve. And sometimes you'll learn very fast, and sometimes it's going to be kind of painful, but it is the important stage. So the League of Women Voters is anxious to help with education. And of course, with that voters term in there, we're also very interested to see that people look at their civic responsibilities. And when there is legislation that is out there having to do with the topic of your concern, then speak up. Have a voice. And the only way that you're really effective is if you understand what the issue is. And so I applaud the Mayflower people in this area for having come together with organization to help educate themselves and to find what has happened in other places, to take that responsibility to create the beginning of a framework so that you can take this action and expand on it, build on it, and become more effective as you're working. So I'm very pleased to be here today. It fits hand in glove with the things that the League of Women Voters do in many different areas. And this one, of course, is high on our concern because for many years we have paid a great deal of attention to water quality issues. Now, one of the things that I think is always interesting is that wetlands are kind of the stepchildren of the environment. And they have always been undervalued as part of the ecosystem, but they provide a range of vital services. They provide food, they filter water, and offer a unique habitat for many species. In spite of this knowledge, like we saw in the video earlier today, half of the world's wetlands have disappeared since 1900. And look what our population has done during that time. Development, conversion, and the pollution pose major threats to devalue these very, very important areas. There was an interesting assessment. You know, a lot of times we don't put value on things until we see a dollar sign by it. And I've always been a little offended by a term that real estate people like to use called highest and best use. And in their definition, the highest and best use for any land, and we look around us here and we see the value that nature has provided to the state of Arkansas. And in the highest and best use mentality, if it isn't paved, it's not worth it. So all of a sudden, we have to, as individuals, property owners, and people who are policymakers, we have to start understanding that value has many other forms than in a building or in a road. And the value is quite an interesting monetary one if you start looking at some history here. The Millennium Ecosystem Assessment gave wetlands a value of $15 trillion in 1997. Now there's less of it today, so supply and demand means that it's probably even worth more. New York City found that it could avoid spending $3.8 billion on a new water waste treatment plant by only investing $1.5 billion in the purchase of land around the reservoirs in the upstate part of New York. This land purifies the water for absolutely free and has eliminated the need for that additional land. So we need to start thinking in terms of long-term value. We know that jobs are something that are discussed very quickly whenever we're talking about well drilling or the pipeline. But we need to think long-term toward the 13th generation and whether or not they're going to have what we're enjoying here today. Now, this afternoon's panelists have come from a variety of expertise, and they will give even greater context to this issue so that I'm sure that you will learn much more about public health, water quality, and the protection of Lake Conway and the wetlands. Our first speaker is Tammie Hynum, who is the chief of the Hazardous Waste Division of Arkansas Department of Environmental Quality. Now, this division is charged with the responsibility of overseeing the disposition of hazardous waste and hazardous site cleanup programs. Ms. Hyman has been with ADEQ for 23 years, and I feel rather safe in assuming that the last 60 days have been some of the most challenging. Ms. Hyman.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, I don't have a formal presentation this afternoon, but I certainly welcome the opportunity to come out here and speak with you guys and answer any questions that I can. As she said, obviously I'm the chief of the Hazardous Waste Division of ADEQ, and part of that division encompasses the emergency response section. They obviously serve the entire state of Arkansas whenever there's an incident similar to this one that we're here talking about today. Obviously, this one being of a large magnitude compared to what we've dealt with in the past 23 years that I've been with the agency. As our role of ADEQ, the Arkansas Department of Emergency Management established what they call a emergency support function number 10. And that basically is how will the state agencies encompassed with assistance from federal agencies deal with a oil release or a hazardous substance release within the state of Arkansas. ADEQ being the environmental state regulatory agency, we obviously serve as the primary lead agency in the function of ESF 10. We don't do that by ourselves. We do that obviously with the proliferation of other state support agencies. I think it's somewhere in the range of 20 to 22 agencies that offer us support. Some of the ones that you guys are probably very familiar with, Arkansas Department of Health, Arkansas Game and Fish. Those are just to name a few that have been at the table with us as we've been dealing with this incident as well as any other crisis within the state of Arkansas. On March 29th, when we realized the complexity of this incident, a unified command was established. That's comprised of 4 or 5 primary people that sit on the unified command. There's the state on-scene coordinator, with ADEQ being the primary lead agency under the ESF 10 functions. We certainly serve, somebody on my staff or myself serves as the state on-scene coordinator. There's a federal on-scene coordinator, which are our counterparts on the federal level that come out of Dallas, out of the Environmental Protection Agency. They've had anywhere from 1 up to, I think I've seen up to 4 actual EPA employees here, and they rotated in a row of the federal on-scene coordinator. Then there's a local on-scene coordinator, and that's Judge Dotson, that I believe many of you know and have heard from during this situation. And then the 4th is called an incident commander, and that's typically the responsible party for the incident that you're dealing with. So there's 4 primary entities of a unified command, keeping in mind that 3 of those serve in a county, local capacity or state or federal capacity, and 1 is a responsible party because we certainly want them to step forward and take the responsible actions that they need to take in an incident. The unified command signs off on, all 4 parties sign off on all waste disposal plans, all emergency response activities, and as we're transitioning out of the emergency response and going into what we call long-term remediation, which is more of the restoration and maintenance of the areas that have been impacted. The unified command is going to step down, as they call it, And ADEQ being an authorized state to handle the hazardous waste and hazardous substances, we will issue an order to the responsible party, ExxonMobil, and it will lay out the criterias of all the plans that they will have to do, the schedules that they will have to adhere to, the cleanup criteria that we will expect them to basically restore all of these areas back to the pre-spill conditions. In our row on the Unified Command, we have taken what we call split samples. We required the responsible party, once the oil was contained with all the booms and things that y'all seen in the waterways, we required the responsible party to go out and collect certain samples. Both what we call a waste sample, where we have the free-floating oil and so forth, if we wanted to see what we were dealing with, as well as samples of your water bodies, the soils within the neighborhood, and along all the drainage pathways. We also dispatched some of our scientists within ADEQ to go out and collect samples at the same location. What that allowed us to do is, while Exxon had their contractors pulling their samples, and they were sending it off to an ADEQ approved certified laboratory, it's a third party independent, has no correlation to ExxonMobil. It's a laboratory that ADEQ has certified to analyze these type samples. Then we pulled our analysis and our sample locations, and we had our in-house ADEQ laboratory run those. When we got the results, that allowed us to correlate. Certainly if we saw a huge difference in the results with the samples being collected at the same location, that would have been a flag for us. What we've seen is a very good correlation in the data. So we've had basically two different labs running data from the same locations, so we can keep apprised and keep a heads up on all the activities going on. Those activities are continuing today. We're still out there from an ADEQ standpoint, pulling surface water samples, and Exxon themselves is also continuing to pull surface water samples. Within the neighborhood area, what we call more the immediate impact area, there's been anywhere from groundwater samples being pulled. I think we've got up to 14 temporary wells on the site where we can pull the groundwater underneath and get a general idea from the data as to what the groundwater impacts may or may not have been underneath that residential area. We've been pulling soil samples both on what we call a surface level, and then we've been coring down and getting it at a depth to determine more of what we call more of the horizontal and the vertical extent of the contamination. As of this past Thursday, there's been several areas that have been signed off on by the Unified Command that the emergency response phase has been completed. Now listen to me real carefully. The emergency response phase has been completed. That means that we're now going to transition in to the full-fledged scope of long-term remediation. The emergency response phase is abating the imminent substantial endangerment, basically getting rid of the visual oil. And then we realize that there may be some residual contamination that remains within the soils, possibly some of the sediments and so forth. So this past Thursday, we signed off, the Unified Command signed off on what we call the cove and the marsh area. About 3 weeks ago or so, we signed off on North Main drainage pathway as it traveled down underneath 365, underneath I-40 to actually connect to the Marsh and Cove area. That was signed off on as far as emergency response activities. The neighborhood in and of itself has yet to have been signed off on. There's still some work going on there. I think they're getting close, but there's still some activities going on. So we've left it in the emergency response phase right now. We are actually currently working with EPA and reviewing a plan that ExxonMobil presented to us at our request that basically told us how they would anticipate going in and gridding off the cove and the marsh area and at what frequency they would collect both water and sediment samples along that entire drainage pathway. And they would run it for a sweep of constituents, volatile organics, semi-volatile organics. You may be familiar with the term PAHs, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, very common in crude oil. There's a list of like 8 to 10 metals that are pretty common in this type of waste stream. So we'll be analyzing for all of those type constituents. When that plan is submitted to us and approved, they will have a schedule that they are expected to go out there and actually implement it. They'll pull their samples. Then once they get the results back, they'll need to put it in a report and compile it and tell us what the results show. EPA and ADEQ will have a list of our staff, our scientists that have been doing this for years. They will actually go over all this data. Game and Fish will be involved in this as well with their biologists and so forth, because we're both looking from a human health protection aspect as well as an ecological protection aspect. You know, when we're dealing with the cove in the wetland area, we want to make sure that it's left and returned back into a condition that it can support the fish, wildlife, and things of that have been in and around that area in the past. And obviously within the neighborhood and all the drainage pathways, we want it to be comfortable both from an ecological standpoint as well as a human health standpoint. So there's going to be a lot of criteria that's going to be established. Ecological endpoints, as we call it, the cleanup expectations, they are very stringent. You know, Emily can, you know, when she used to work at ADEQ, I think she can speak as well to the fact that, you know, the ecological endpoints are very stringent. And a lot of times if you're cleaning up to an ecological endpoint, you're protective to a human health endpoint, because those levels, you know, they're actually in, instead of walking on it, they're actually in and around kicking up the sediments and things like that. So we feel very comfortable with the approach that we have, the progress that we're making. I think the two key points that I wanted to talk with you guys about today, I've touched on, and I want to close and reiterate that I'll answer any questions that you guys have. The Unified Command, you've got the majority of the Unified Command being your county judge that's here to protect you guys on the county level. You've got your federal government, the United States Environmental Protection Agency that's here, obviously protective for the United States of America. And then you've got ADEQ there, obviously working in partnership with folks like Game and Fish, the Department of Health, and things of that nature. And we're here obviously for protection of the citizens of the state of Arkansas. That's 3/4 of the Unified Command. And we're calling in the reports that we're required. We're telling them where the waste needs to go, how the waste needs to be handled, what's the most appropriate disposal method for those, and so forth. And they're signing off as their commitment to follow through with what we've asked for to be put into those plans. Once the Unified Command steps down, my second message that I wanted everybody to make sure that you understood is we're not done. You may hear in the press releases and things of that nature that the Unified Command has stepped down. That just means that it's no longer an emergency response action. That means that the emergency response activities have been abated, but that doesn't mean there's still not cleanup that needs to be addressed. And that's going to be done under the purview of ADEQ, the agency that I work for. Being an authorized state, we're going to call in the plans, and obviously Game and Fish is going to be at the table with us, Department of Health from a human health protection standpoint, and then my counterparts at EPA also will continue to be involved in the review of all of those results and so forth. So that's just kind of a quick overview of kind of where we've been over the last 60 days and where we hope to go in the next days forward. And I certainly would answer any questions about what we do to the DM.
I think we probably will take questions at the end so that you'll have a full range of the discussion here to shape your questions. Our next speaker, and thank you very much. Our next speaker will be April Lane, and she's with the Faulkner County Concerned Citizens Advisory Group. And she's also in a group, Environmental Alliance at UCA. And is the president of that group. So she's involved in wearing several hats. Natural gas drilling activity changed life as usual for April. As a mother concerned about health and safety conditions for her family, she reached out to other concerned families and looked for the possibilities of independent air monitoring. After becoming involved with the Bucket Brigade, which if you don't know, I think you'll find it a very fascinating organization, she She was well positioned in her work in the Mayflower area with residents when this emergency hit. She had been using the bucket brigade information to help monitor some of the natural gas stations, the compressor stations, and the various wells that were around. So it's interesting how this subject of the pipe run and the gas drilling are kind of the two twin sisters with the same parents. And we have many overlapping issues, and it was, I think, quite ironic and fortunate that there were already people in this area who had some idea of how we needed to start getting hold of this help. April.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Today I'm going to talk specifically about the air monitoring that we perform with Faulkner County Bucket Brigade. I'm going to give a disclaimer, I am not an expert. I work with experts from around the country. I use biologists, toxicologists, chemists from across the country to take the data that we collect, interpret it, and then put it into a form that is easily understandable for the public. This is a really long presentation, so I'm going to keep this short. You're going to see me skipping over some slides. But I want to tell you a little bit about how Faulkner County Bucket Brigade got started. We were actually in response to a lot of air pollution that had been occurring in the Fayetteville Shale. So this project was not intended to be used in Mayflower. We were lucky enough that we had some funding left, that when the spill occurred, we were able to react and go and take some samples in those first few days and have something to look at to see what were we finding in the air and how should we approach the public in educating and informing them and their families on what they were being exposed to. The goal of the Faulkner County Bucket Brigade is to monitor community health and provide information to the community so that they can become an active stakeholder in the process of community monitoring. We were established in November and were trained in the chain of custody procedures and how to perform grab sampling techniques. There were 7 of us that were trained, and then we began distributing pollution logs to the community, which we brought some over on the table today that you can take with you. It's a good tool to be able to identify what you're being exposed to if you live near industrial activity or anything that's producing air pollution. It's an easy to assemble design. I brought the bucket. It's actually this is the bucket that we use to perform grab sampling. It breaks down chemicals into parts per billion range, and it tests for 70 gases or volatile organic compounds, VOCs, and 20 sulfur compounds. We responded on March 29th to the Mayflower spill. We collected one sample. We responded on March 30th, the day after the spill. We collected the first sample at the site where the majority of the oil was collected, so near the drainage ditch before it went under the interstate, headed over into the coal area. That's where a vast majority of it was collecting at that time, and where first responders were working really hard to try to get to kind of collect in an area where they were backing out. On April 2nd, we took the second sample, and on April 3rd, we took our third and final sample. And this is a map of where we took our samples at. There's sample 1, sample 2, and sample 3. This is a picture of where we took the first sample, sample 2, and sample 3. Now, when we analyze these results, like I told you before, we have to get lead scientists appropriate to be able to identify these. We use a EPA certified lab. And the results from the first sample that we found was a mixture of 30 chemicals. Each chemical has its own property and health effects. And what we wanted to touch on and stress to the public was we don't know what the cumulative effects of these compounds do. There's a lot of information out there, but something that I really want all of you to take away today is that we are in the era of what I call the frontier of air monitoring. I don't want to say it's brand new, but it is a growing field, and it is something that is constantly being adjusted, and there's constantly new improvements being made in technology. So that's something that is really important for you to know, is that when we talk about some of these chemicals I'm fixing to list out, they individually have health effects. Many of them we do know something about, but there is a lot of questions, and there are a lot of things we don't know. I'm not going to be shy about telling you if I don't know the answer to something, or if there's something we don't know. We just don't know. Results 2 and 3 were taken around residents back behind the spill. They were experiencing a lot of health symptoms, which made us look at trying to sample back behind there. The issues with some of the air monitoring by both myself and some of the air monitoring done by CTEC and some of the independents was it was very windy, and that was something that we talked about together, was that conditions to sample in those first few days with the rain and the wind and a lot of the weather we were having was not ideal. These were the chemicals detected in sample 1. Benzene, toluene, hexane, cyclohexane, heptane, and octane exceeded some screening levels. Benzene was actually exceeded the Texas TCEQ long-term health effects screening and the Louisiana ambient air standard. Hexane exceeded the Texas short-term health effects screening level. Cyclohexane exceeded the Texas TCEQ long-term health effects screening level. And then heptane and octane also exceeded that. Something that's really important to know is that you're going to hear a lot of talk about what's safe, like what levels are safe. How do we know how it's going to affect us as community members who live in these areas 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and work there, our kids play there. There is no safe level for benzene. There is no safe level for being exposed to that short or long term. You're being put at a risk. Something I want to make sure I'm clear about between the difference between the tools we use, which is canister sampling, and then the tools that sometimes is used by some state-by-state agencies and then other independent agencies, is there's a difference in what the equipment can detect. So monitoring in park pavilion is the best way to identify short and long-term exposures to vulnerable populations, women, children, elderly, those with pre-existing conditions. In our opinion, the industry monitoring is not appropriate in identifying the risk to these populations and community exposures because they historically are known to use part per million detection limits. Part per million detection limits are best applied to occupational standards, so healthy men who are working on site 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's not appropriate to take part per million sampling and you're not detecting certain chemicals in the air to say that general populations are not likely to have health effects. You have to look for these chemicals in those low detections, otherwise you're not going to find them, and I think that is misleading to tell the public that you're not picking up chemicals that you're testing for in part per million, when if you were to test in part per million, you will probably find them in lower detections. A good example is 5 part per billion detections in benzene over a 14-day period can result in long-term health effects according to long-term exposure limits. Monitors at occupational, CTEC monitors at occupational standards, a level above the recommended detection setting to address community exposure. Some of the airline, I'm just going to go over that. So what does this mean? What does those 30 chemicals that I just showed you and some of those that did go over some of those standards mean? We consulted with Dr. Neil Hyman, who is a Lone Star Sierra Club and former Texas Commission on Environmental Quality Inspector. He quotes that each of the 30 hydrocarbons measured in the Mayflower releases a toxic chemical on its own and may pose a threat to health depending on various exposure and individual factors. I go on to kind of list some of those long-term and short-term health effects. You can find a few copies of that over on the table. And then we did give a list of recommendations. We met with Exxon one day, with Dr. Super, who was one of the experts that attended our first town hall meeting, and we tried to relay to them how important it was to take the community that had been affected to put some public service announcements out there and to try to put together a centralized local clinic where you bring in some occupational and environmental medical specialists, doctors who specialize in these types of toxins and how they can interact with the community. Our answers that we got were not something that was ideal. It was basically tell people to call the claims hotline and we will address any and all valid claims. We felt that wasn't appropriate. I'm going to be really frank about that. We felt like there was a lot more that could be done in those first few days to try to educate and inform mothers with young children and people who were being exposed, especially even on the interstate, who were driving through that were being exposed to some of these odors and toxins. I also brought a copy, and I think everyone got one, of the Wellness Super's report. We used her as an expert to go through this data, to also look at some of the data that's been posted on the ADEQ website. So you can kind of go through there and look at some of these health effects. A lot of the sampling being done by industry was coming in part per million. And just so you know, part per million, part per billion, part per million is just 1,000 times. There's 1,000 times difference between the two. So if you were to picture an adult and a small child, part per million sampling, you're looking at the head, at the top of the head of the adult. Part per billion sampling, you're looking at the feet of the child. So you're finding those smaller, those more minute particles that you normally aren't going to detect. They have some of the acute health impacts, are headaches, eye irritation, nose, throat, and lung irritation. You can turn over to the back and kind of see some of the other health symptoms. There's a laundry list of them. So feel free to look through this after Scott's presentation. If you have some questions for me afterwards, I want to try to keep my time to the point so that Scott has plenty of time.